Thank you so much, Bernie, and thank you to the Institute for supporting this program and actually for creating a forum for us to have a discussion today on school discipline and school climate. I want to talk a little bit about how we think about discipline. You know, we're throwing these words around so much, but how do we really think of these in context? And, you know, as was noted in the introduction, my name's Janel George. I'm with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. That's a civil rights organization founded by the late Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. And we successfully litigated the Brown versus Board of Education case, which effectively invalidated racial segregation, racial apartheid in our nation's public schools. Unfortunately, even decades later, we're still seeing some of the vestiges of racial segregation, right? We see it in resource inequities, we see it in teacher pay discrepancies, and we also see it, unfortunately, in the racial stereotypes that really underlie some of the issues that we're seeing with discipline disparities. So we're a small group. I hope we can really talk frankly and openly about some of these issues. And I really want to start, you know, about how we think about the word discipline. So when you hear the word discipline, what comes to mind? You're teachers, so you can just yell out. Like, what are some of the things that come to mind? Negative.
Punitive.
Punitive.
Suspensions.
Suspensions.
Reactive.
Reactive. Consequences.
Corrective.
Corrective.
Disciplinary hearings.
Okay.
Proactive.
Proactive. Okay. It's interesting that no one says discipline is an instructive tool. You know, when you're, maybe there's a kid acting out and you kind of say, like a lot of teachers tend to say, this is a teachable moment. You know, we can use this to instruct. But what about changing the paradigm and thinking about discipline as a teaching tool as something that we contextualize within education, not something used to push students out of the classroom, but something that's used to really instruct and inform all the students, not getting rid of the problem students, quote unquote, so that all the other students can learn, but is within the context of education. So when we talk about punitive, overly punitive discipline practices, we're talking about some of the things that other folks just mentioned: suspensions, expulsions, school-based arrests, things that bring students out of the general classroom, out of general learning. We think of tasers and pepper spray, which are used, unfortunately, very frequently in a lot of schools. Restraint and seclusion. Unfortunately, the data shows that students with disabilities are disproportionately subjected to restraint and seclusion. So this is very widespread in our public schools. And as Bernie mentioned in the beginning, a lot of this is rooted in zero tolerance policies that follow tragic shootings like that in Columbine High School in Colorado and similar school shootings around the country. But again, we're seeing issues with the fact that these zero tolerance policies are not effective. And in fact, Colorado is one of the leaders in reforming these zero tolerance policies. And while originally applied to limit firearms or possession of firearms on campus, these policies, zero tolerance policies, came to be applied to minor offenses like dress code violations. So we saw this proliferation of these zero tolerance policies where students were being suspended or expelled or taken out of the general classroom for very, very minor infractions. Also, like in addition to dress code violations, infractions like disrespect. So in the past, these are all sanctions that might have been dealt with by a reprimand or in-school sanction, but now they're leading to students being pushed outside of the classroom. In particular, Black males, students who receive special education services, and students who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered have disproportionately received and been subjected to exclusionary discipline, placing them at increased risk of the negative consequences that accompany these kind of discipline disparities. And according to federal data, we know that African American youth are more than 3 times as likely than their white peers to be suspended or expelled from school, often due, again, to minor misbehavior. So again, we have to kind of shift what we're thinking. These aren't the bad actors. These aren't students who are bringing firearms to school or committing violent offenses. These are for minor infractions. And in addition, researchers note that these disparities cannot be attributed to more frequent or severe misbehavior by youth of color. Decades of research bears out the youth of color misbehave at the same rates as their peers, but are punished more severely and more frequently than their white peers for the very same offenses. In fact, while excessive discipline affects all students in negative ways, over 40 years of research confirms that unjustifiable approaches to discipline harm historically disadvantaged and discriminated against groups more than others. So what's the cause for this? How do we account for this? Are people actually just purposefully targeting certain students for punitive discipline? This is where we come to the issue of implicit bias and how implicit bias plays out in discretionary, especially more of these subjective discipline categories. So this is Tiana Parker. This is a picture of Tiana. She's a 7-year-old student in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tiana was sent home from her public charter school and told that her hairstyle, and you can see she has a cute hairstyle with a little flower in her hair. She was told that her locks were unpresentable and violated the dress code. In the school's dress code term styles like locks or afros to be faddish and unacceptable and unpresentable. And the school administrators refused to change or amend the policy. And because Tiana's hair is locked, the only way that she could change her hair is by cutting it off. And she didn't want to do that, and her dad didn't want her to do that. So Tiana's dad took her, withdrew her from that public charter school and enrolled her in another school. And thankfully, due to the widespread media attention, the school did eventually change its discipline policy. But this is actually a perfect example of how we see some race and gender stereotypes that underlie discretionary discipline decisions play out. And this is an issue that we highlighted in our recent report with the National Women's Law Center. And I put some copies of our report on the table. And our report focuses on African American girls in education, but in particular we focus on and touch on school discipline disparities and how the confluence of race and gender stereotypes really underlies some of those disparities that we're seeing. And again, we see someone like Tiana told that her natural hairstyle is unacceptable, and locked into that are some undercurrents, right, of race and gender stereotypes. And we all know that schools and classrooms reflect the social structures and systems of our society, right, and reinforce cultural beliefs. So the same stereotypes and cultural norms that we see play out in society are reflected in classrooms. So when we see girls who are told that they're too loud or too aggressive or that they're violating the dress code, maybe they're told that their skirt is too tight, when honestly it could just be an issue of body type. Those are all code words for telling them that they're not conforming to prevalent notions of femininity or womanhood. And when the decision is discretionary, that means when the person in power has the discretion of whether to discipline or not, then bias really comes into play. And this is not always conscious bias. This could be subconscious bias that affects our perceptions of people and associates certain thoughts and internalize, and again, subconscious beliefs about people, certain races, genders, or ethnicities. And we all have these implicit biases. All of us possess them, right? The public charter school that Tiana attended that told her that her hairstyle was unacceptable was an all-black public charter school. So this is not about one race against another or one gender against another. We all possess these internalized beliefs, and they play out, again, subconsciously in those discretionary discipline decisions. So when we speak about implicit bias, again, we're talking about these internalized biases, and we see some of the same things with there are a lot of female teachers who honestly tell young women, you know, maybe you don't want to take those advanced placement courses. Maybe science, technology, engineering, and mathematics just aren't the right thing for you. So again, when we talk about implicit bias, we all have to admit that all of us possess these biases. And this is a great definition that I found from a piece by Tom Rudd, Racial Disproportionality in School Discipline, where he defines implicit bias as a mental process that causes us to have negative feelings and attitudes about people based on characteristics like race, ethnicity, age, and appearance. And because this cognitive process functions in our unconscious mind, we're typically not consciously aware of the negative racial biases that we develop over the course of our lifetimes. And in the general population, implicit bias often supports the stereotypical caricature of Black youth as irresponsible, dishonest, and dangerous. And again, we see these play out in the more subjective disciplinary decisions. For instance, research and data show that African American students are disciplined more frequently for these subjective offenses. And those include like excessive noise or being loud or disrespect, while white students are disciplined for more objective offenses like smoking and vandalism. So admittedly, we need more data on the type of offenses. The Civil Rights Data Collection, which is the national data collection that the Office for Civil Rights under the Department of Education collects from schools, doesn't always collect information about the type of sanction. So admittedly, we definitely need more information about that. But I do want to give an example of an Ohio study that showed that African American girls were disproportionately disciplined for disobedience and disruptive behavior. Again, very subjective discipline categories. And as mentioned in this definition of implicit bias, this often results in the criminalization of youth of color and plays out in the overly punitive discipline of youth of color in our nation's schools, but also in the over-policing of youth of color in neighborhoods across the country, whereby in discretionary discipline decisions, youth of color are seldom given the benefit of the doubt. And I want to show another example here and just briefly talk about discipline disparities in African American girls. This is a picture of Vanessa Van Dyke. She was also sanctioned for her hair. She was told that her hair was too big and it was a distraction for other students. And in fact, African American girls, again, finding themselves at this intersection, right, of race and gender stereotypes, are impacted by both of these stereotypes. And data show that African American girls are suspended at 6 times the rate of white girls and more than most boys, except for African American boys and Native American boys. So what are the consequences? Why does this even matter that students are being pushed out of the classroom? Well, because this results in the loss of valuable instruction time, it increases high school dropout rates, and increases likelihood for involvement with the juvenile justice system. So while the offenses themselves might be minor, the consequences for these infractions and being pushed out of school are great. So again, they're being pushed out for these minor infractions. So then what do we really do about it? We can look at the joint discipline guidance issued by the Departments of Education and Justice in January 2014, which includes some very good recommendations for things that schools can do. And I know that the other panelists will talk about, such as implementing social and emotional learning curricula and restorative justice practices. But let's all preface this by saying, we also know that schools and teachers and students need funding for more support and services. I talk to teachers all the time through work with the Dignity Dignity in Schools campaign, which is a coalition of 95 organizations from 24 different states, including a lot of teacher-led advocacy organizations that say, we would love to implement social and emotional learning curricula, but we can't afford it, or we don't have funding or the time or the opportunity to do ongoing professional development. So really advocating for funding and support and services is really key. And we have to really support a lot of these proven best practices, again, like restorative practices. And we have to recognize that these issues are systemic. And so systemic solutions are needed. Again, ongoing professional development opportunities where we can talk frankly about implicit bias and how it plays out in the classroom. More support for classroom management, especially for new teachers or non-credentialed teachers or teachers who have received their certification through alternative means. And universal screening, early screening for students' academic, social, and emotional needs to ensure that we have culturally responsive and trauma responsive services in place. One thing we found in our report on African American girls in education was that a lot of girls who were disciplined were actually victims of trauma. So they were acting out in response to a lot of the trauma that they had experienced, but rather than getting the services and supports they needed, they were actually sanctioned and pushed out of school. And I just want to end by saying that I hope that this is a beginning of a conversation. And I know, again, working with a wide coalition of 95 organizations, there are a lot of differences in opinion about discipline. A lot of teachers feel like the blame is being put on them because they have huge class sizes of up to 50 students, and they're trying to teach these students how to learn, and it's hard when you have 2 or 3 disruptive students. So they feel a lot of times placed in a very difficult position, and a lot of parents actually feel excluded from the entire discipline process. Someone mentioned the disciplinary hearings where sometimes parents don't even get notice about the hearings or are able to appear and advocate on behalf of their children. So again, I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation that we can talk more frankly about implicit bias and race and gender stereotypes and how they play out in our discretionary discipline decisions. Thank you.